First of all, thank you very much, Claire, for joining us. I'll just introduce you properly as Clare Woodcraft, Executive Director at the Centre for Strategic Philanthropy at the University of Cambridge's Judge Business School. So good morning to you, Claire, and thanks for joining us today.
Good morning, and thank you for having me.
Well, delighted to have you. I wonder if maybe just as we get started here, if you'd be willing just to say, for a minute or two, just a little bit about yourself and your background and what's led you to where you are today.
Yes, absolutely, delighted to. So my background is really in the development space. So essentially looking at how we create socioeconomic outcomes and impact at scale. So that started very much with my academic career in the sense that I studied languages, Arabic, and then I did my master's in development studies. And then went on to work principally in emerging markets. So I spent most of my career working in emerging markets in this space. So either in the traditional donor community or working with the private sector, looking at how businesses can create social impact, and then obviously more latterly moving into the foundation space. And I think all of that just came from a very kind of intrinsic interest from a very young age of this issue. What creates progress? What does it mean to be born in one country that is very developed versus one that has more growth needs or institutional needs, I should say. And it's just always been a fascination of mine, my whole life, really. So I guess my studies, kind of emerged organically and then evolved even more naturally into this kind of career of essentially social impact, but in those various different capacities.
Excellent, thank you. Well, that's fascinating background, and obviously now you're leading the Centre for Strategic Philanthropy. I wonder if, just to kick things off then in terms of our discussion, if you might tell us a little bit more about the sort of mission and vision and the goals of the centre.
Yes, absolutely. So the centre was really established based on the vision of the founder, Badr Jafar himself, an Emirati philanthropist. And he had witnessed similar trends. So I have to say that those that I had witnessed myself as a practitioner, not just in the Middle East, but also beyond, of the need for really philanthropy to deliver more impact. So I think whilst historically we have seen a huge amount of resources invested in the sector and all massively well-intentioned, I think there's kind of a global recognition to a large extent that more can be done in terms of securing impact. Social impact is not something that's easy to create. It's very challenging. Creating social value at scale, I would argue, is much more challenging than creating commercial value at scale. And yet there is a lot to learn from the business sector around how we create value at scale. So I think the centre was really born out of that need for philanthropy to be as impactful as possible, to use those philanthropic dollars as judiciously as possible, to share data on the sector, because we know that there's a significant lack, particularly in emerging markets, to share best practice and really to learn from each other, to learn from what's worked, but also to learn from what hasn't worked. So Badr's vision was really to focus on emerging markets, where of course there is also significant growth of philanthropic capital. So the idea is that we would support young up-and-coming philanthropists from these markets, and specifically the Arab world, Africa and Southeast Asia, to come together, build a community, deliver more impact, deliver more of a stronger community across those markets, within those markets, encouraging shared learning, shared observations, and improved data for all of those markets, so that essentially we can improve, maximize the impact of this new growth of philanthropy from those markets. But also there was a real interest and ambition to create more voice for the global South, so that those markets have more input into both global development policy, so everything that relates to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, but also more broadly into philanthropy. So how do we encourage more philanthropy? And one of the particular challenges of, in those markets, how do we regulate these new pools of philanthropic capital coming to market?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And actually, I was going to ask you something else first of all, but your comment laterally there about, I guess, how do you regulate things? I wonder if you can say a little bit more about that, in terms of, in your experience,
how much does tradition and culture and for example, then the legal framework or the regulatory framework, governance, for example, how much does that present both an opportunity for those emerging nations, but also how much does it present a real challenge in the context of philanthropy?
Yes, absolutely. It is one of the key areas that I think we have been looking at the Centre, by no means the only one. And I should just say that the Centre has three core pillars of activity. So the first one is obviously research. We are a research centre inside a university. The second is teaching. Again, we are inside a very well-established pedagogic institution, so we have our executive education program. And the third is thought leadership. But within all of those pillars, I think this is an issue that has come up quite consistently through our own initial research on emerging market philanthropy, particularly looking at the growth. When we run our executive education programs, we ran one recently specifically for the Arab world. We have another one in October. The cohorts have been bringing some of these challenges, and when we've brought that subject to the fore, it's really gained a lot of traction. Because in essence, many of these markets simply don't have legislation that covers philanthropic capital. In many markets, in all three of those areas, Middle East, Africa, Southeast Asia, it's early days. So you see some governments and some markets putting forward some nascent legislation on what you can or can't do, how to register a foundation, whether you can create a trust, how you create a board for a foundation or not. But I think the historical challenge has been two things. So one, in some of these markets, the civil society, I should say, civil society has been a sense of potential opposition to regimes that are not as democratic as they might be. So there's always been slight, I guess, anxiety on the part of governments about the role of civil society in some of these markets, not all, and the role of grassroots organizations when they mobilize. So this kind of suspicion, I guess, of civil society has, on the one hand, led some governments to fear philanthropy because they see it as emerging from this space. And the other, which is linked very strongly to that, is they don't necessarily understand it. So I still think there's a huge amount of misunderstanding about what is the role of philanthropy. So obviously philanthropy is private capital for public good. It's as simple as that as far as I'm concerned. However, of course, it is such a heterogeneous sector coming from so many different sources, from private individuals, from organizations, institutions, religious institutions, civil institutions, multiple others. And of course, you have this huge growth coming from businesses that want to get more and more involved, who are moving beyond CSR, really looking to deliver philanthropic capital to market. And I think, ourselves within the sector, we've created quite a complexity of lexicon, of language, of structures, of sources, such that governments in these markets, particularly because philanthropic capital has grown so quickly and exponentially over the last few years with the maturation of capital markets and family businesses wanting to deploy more capital in this space. So I think on one hand, you've got that historical suspicion of what civil society is up to, what are they doing over there, and where is this money coming from, and where is it going to? And then on the other hand, you've got this kind of new awakening of, well, we recognize that this is a huge source of capital for social good that can help governments deliver on the SDGs, but what is this thing? You know, what is a social entrepreneur versus a foundation versus an impact fund versus blended finance versus CSR versus strategic philanthropy versus entrepreneurial philanthropy versus venture philanthropy? We talk about things within our sector like system change, and these things are big ideas, big ambition, often complicated terminology and complicated structures, quite frankly. If you look at blended finance, one of the most popular parts of our own executive education program, people really want to understand more. It's complicated. You're talking about bringing commercial sector capital onto the impact continuum and combining it with philanthropic capital. You're talking about grants, buying down the risk. This kind of conversation is complicated even for those within the sector. So when you're talking about governments who don't necessarily have specialized teams, I think there is just that lack of understanding. I think COVID has changed that, though, I should say. So where we've gone from historical suspicion and in some cases actually regulating against capital flows So we have seen that in many markets. I've certainly seen that firsthand in the Middle East. So governments actually blocking flows of philanthropic capital, to them understanding, partly, I would argue, on the back of the catalyst that is COVID, that this is capital that can support public sector spending and can allow for the delivery of the Sustainable Development Goals, and can also bring, of course, one of the fundamental powers of philanthropy, innovation to governments, to the social impact space.
Yeah. No, it's fascinating. I mean, one of the things that we have always said that we feel passionate and strongly about, and I can hear a lot of that coming across in what you're saying, is the power of philanthropy. You know, to leverage this change, to leverage good, to make a real difference. And I happen to notice that in addition to the education that you do in a formal sense, you talked about thought leadership. You know, your Twitter feed recently is got the hashtag, you know, shift the power.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wondered if you could bring that to life a little bit more as well. You know, what is the motivation and the story behind that hashtag at the moment that's trending?
Absolutely. So the hashtag shift the power wasn't our invention. I should start by saying that, but I will explain how we came to it in a second. But should confirm that the very essence of the center at the university, and indeed the vision of our founder, was, as I said, bringing voice to the global south. So, and I myself have seen this firsthand in my career, both working in development with traditional development, you know, aid organizations and the like, that often there simply wasn't voice on the ground for the local communities that were ostensibly going to benefit from this inflow of, be it aid finance or philanthropic capital. So I think that's something, that frustration has been around for a very long time, since the days of discourse around aid effectiveness in the 90s. You know, so why is it that international organizations or the global north are the ones calling the shots in terms of development policy, in terms of philanthropy, in terms of deciding where this money is deployed, and more importantly, how? So what is the mechanism, and also to whom? So is this money going to international organizations in the global south, or is it going to grassroots organizations that are at the front line of these communities? So I think that is a space that has been growing. It's a conversation that's been getting more and more vociferous, and I guess frustratingly hasn't really led to a huge amount of action until now. And again, I think COVID has proven a catalyst in this space. But Shift the Power was something that was happening. There was a lot of actual events and activities happening around that space coming out of sub-Saharan Africa, even before our center was created, which we weren't necessarily aware of. But when we did our first report on COVID-19, where we were looking at, okay, has COVID had an impact on philanthropy in the global south in a way that it has managed to crystallize some of the positive changes that we wanted to happen historically? And one of those was around power dynamics. So our report, absolutely, we interviewed over 25 people from across those markets working in philanthropy, and they consistently cited this challenge of not having sufficient power or local voice to point out some of the flaws of the way in which philanthropic capital was deployed in their markets. And yet COVID had given them a new opportunity to be much more vociferous and to call this out. And in a way, you know, at the height of the crisis, there was we simply cannot continue to try and navigate these overly complex bureaucratic structures to access philanthropic capital from the north at a time of crisis. We simply need to get money to market, and we need to change things radically. And you guys in the global north need to be listening much more to the reality on the ground, because we're here witnessing what is happening because of COVID. And of course, there were a whole load of other structural challenges that were happening at the time, a reduction in global north capital going to the global south, just the whole, the whole world trying to figure out how to manage the COVID crisis. So we saw that trend in our COVID-19 report, and we highlighted it as one of the very positive things that had happened during COVID, that it was encouraging both global north foundations to change the way in which they deploy philanthropic capital, but also encouraging global south communities to come together, to look at peer funding, peer lending, sharing data, building networks, just being much more connected horizontally, as it were, to build greater impact for their communities. So at the end of the report, we started to get to know, well, during the course of developing the report, we got to know more of these organizations, some of these, powerful, very articulate leaders in the global south saying enough is enough, this needs to change. So we felt that we wanted to continue the conversation and create a space. Obviously, being inside the University of Cambridge, we have we have powerful convening power. And we wanted to be able to create a space to discuss this more and say, well, okay, we've highlighted the problem, but now what's the solution? What do you actually need to do to shift the power? And at the same time, the Shift the Power hashtag had gone from a series of conferences and activities, as I say, largely out of sub-Saharan Africa, had actually become a website and sort of an organization behind the website. So we felt that we wanted to be able to contribute something positive. We thought by creating a space and inviting leaders from the Global South in philanthropy, that perhaps some, are less well known than they absolutely should be, that we felt this was an opportunity to bring their voices to the fore in line with the mission of the center, and to hear what they have to say around the practical applications of, so what needs to change? How can we build on this trend, this changing power dynamic that can be extremely impactful if it is further nourished and entrenched, and if it doesn't become something that, as COVID fades, that then perhaps we revert to the what I would argue often flawed practices of the past.
Yeah.
And so that might be actually an example of where there is some learning already happening, as in the global south, the emerging markets are already educating if you like, the global north, if I can contextualize in that way, the countries that might be seen as this kind of leaders or experts in philanthropy. Are there any other areas where you think that either the sort of more established philanthropic nations can learn more from these emerging markets, and vice versa? Is there still scope for some of that learning to go in what some might see as the more obvious way? Perhaps some might see it arrogantly in the more obvious way, but what learning can flow in one direction to the other in terms of philanthropy?
So I think there's something we need to acknowledge, that we are trying to address what I think Rockefeller first coined the phrase, wicked problems. These are massively complex socioeconomic structural issues that have often been around for decades. So the work that we're trying to do as philanthropists focused on development is very challenging. It's complex. So inevitably, in my opinion, you're always going to be learning, right? There's always going to be, we haven't nailed these issues around, eradicating poverty, ensuring that all women have access to relevant health and education, ensuring that children's rights are protected, ensuring that the environment is protected. All of these huge global entrenched socioeconomic complex issues, there is no one clear fire solution to any of them, despite the global community having worked on them for decades. I mean, you remember that the Sustainable Development Goals were preceded by the Millennial Development Goals, which morphed into the SDGs, of which there are, 160 odd versus, specific individual areas, a lot more even than we had with the Millennial Development Goals. So all of that just to say that the situation of resolving global challenges is getting more complicated as we look at structural challenges such as climate change. So I think the focus on learning is only going to grow, and I think should be absolutely institutionalized inside any organization working in the space of philanthropy. So even, I remember from my experience of running a foundation, or even at Emirates Foundation, or even when I worked at Child Foundation, that internal institutional learning was very important. So what are we learning on a daily basis about what works and what doesn't? How can we share what doesn't so that others don't make the same mistakes? And how can we capture that? So that's also a challenge. So I think too often we're so busy with our day jobs, we don't take time out to capture and document what works and what doesn't. So that whole piece around learning, I think, is hugely important. And again, a reason why our center exists, the reason why it's inside a learning institution, is that this stuff is massively complicated. We're talking about the future of the planet. We need to share, and learn. So I think that's super important. And I know from my own, mea culpa experience, that sometimes you get so focused on the operational day job that you do forget to stand back and say, let me take time out to learn and share. Sure. So I think that's hugely important. Now, whether, is the North learning from the South or vice versa, I think, it's too easy to get into a binary construct here. And whilst I do think there is a very strong need to call out things like, or to call for things like the decolonization of philanthropy, really trying to understand some of the policy decisions that have fed into this sector historically, I think there's an opportunity for everybody to learn from everybody, quite frankly. No one can create socioeconomic system change or social value alone. It's impossible. And no one can create it in a short term. I always get very frustrated with philanthropic organizations, and sometimes too often boards of those organizations, saying, well, here we've got a 1-year project, how come we haven't fixed the problem? Well, we're talking about complex issues that will take generations to fix, even if that is the right term. You know, this is about growing as a society, and those things take time. So I think we should constantly be exchanging between the South and the North. However, having said all of that, I do think that COVID was a real epiphany, or maybe not even an epiphany, maybe it just crystallized kind of what we already knew, that the global North didn't have enough understanding of what's happening on the ground. There wasn't enough voice from local grassroots organizations who were dealing with these issues. There were perhaps, you know, too many layers between those organizations on the ground and funding coming from, in the main, global North organizations. And I think now that recognition is there. But, you know, in a way, none of this is new. I mean, we've been calling for better listening for decades. We've been calling for a shift in the way development policy is put together for decades. I mean, I remember when I was studying development in the early 90s, you know, things like structural adjustment programs, the role of the World Bank and the like were being strongly criticized even then. And sometimes I feel a bit frustrated that, you know, this kind of the approach to development is still, in some respects, at the discussion stage rather than the application stage. And yet I do think that COVID, you know, notwithstanding the horrific and very negative consequences of the pandemic, has created an opportunity now to start to equalize some of the power structures within the sector, and thus therein help this much more mutual learning exchange, rather than simply developing countries having to receive insights and knowledge from the North, which might not be applicable to their local circumstances.
Yeah, no, that's interesting and a very, very well made point. I think, without wishing to oversimplify something that you said in there and conflate it either with something unfairly, I'm just thinking now about this idea of knowledge on the ground, people having more of a voice, shifting the power, part of that, of course. I wonder if I can join that up a little bit in your mind and get your thoughts on the need perhaps for grant-making organizations, maybe it's individual philanthropists, allowing greater flexibility on their giving. So sometimes perhaps foundations in particular have maybe been too rigid in their approach, and you just referenced as well an example of a 1-year program. Why has it not solved the problem? So I wonder if you could give me your thoughts and your view around this debate that's been raging around, you know, whether there should be more flexibility from grant givers around, you know, funding programs or having more flexible funding, more unrestricted funding, for example. What's your take on all of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, our COVID-19 report that we put out last year very much highlighted what is known as institutional voids in the emerging markets. I mean, this is really kind of, to some extent, what defines a developing country, is that there are institutional voids, and that could be anything from infrastructure to regulation to networks to education to competence and capacity. And this is something that I've seen in my career, both from the development side and the more focused philanthropic side, is that, you know, most of my career I've spent with all the organizations I've worked with, because I've worked in the developing world, building that capacity. So figuring out how do we get the right skills, expertise, systems, back office, front office, really trying to create organizations that are resilient. So that is an ongoing challenge. And it's something that's also, again, been acknowledged for a very long time. With COVID crisis, I think that's come out much more, that this idea that we need to build capacity, again, it's not something new, but I think it's kind of been mainstreamed in a way, if you like. But we also know at the same time that capacity building is not something that donors necessarily like to do, be they aid donors or philanthropic donors. You know, it's not the sexy, easy to measure thing that other areas might be. You know, if you go into health or education, and I'm not suggesting that they are easy to develop outcomes, but they're easier in some senses to measure when you've got tangible numbers and and the tools for recording outcomes are easier than if you're trying to talk about institutional development. You know, so how do you measure if you've achieved institutional development or not? You can, of course, but it's more challenging and it's less obvious and it's more time consuming. It's something where you've got to make patient capital available and not just short-term fixes. And that, again, too often, sadly, in our sector is not what philanthropic donors want to see. I mean, understandably, they want impact, but often they want it quickly. And thus they tend not to go down the route of looking at, okay, how can we support institutional capacity building? And yet that therein, I think, is the most important aspect of philanthropy. If we want philanthropic capital really to create social impact at scale, you need to have the capacity both to receive, absorb, and deploy it. And I think, you know, if we look at why philanthropic capital hasn't achieved impact in many places, and ditto aid, bilateral, multilateral development aid, it's because there wasn't the capacity to receive it, to absorb it and deploy it. And I certainly witnessed that firsthand, particularly in my first job when I first finished my master's degree, and I went to work in Palestine, where there was suddenly a huge influx of donor aid. And yet the small grassroots organizations on the ground simply, in many cases, didn't have the capacity to absorb that aid, understand how to deploy it, et cetera, et cetera. And no one was particularly interested in creating that capacity. So which is kind of ironic, because if you want to create impact with your philanthropic capital, but you know that the vehicles are not there to create the impact, why would you not create the vehicles? Why continue to just simply disperse? Now, I think that has changed. It is changing. COVID is changing that. I think one of the core issues therein is this idea of, as you said, unrestricted capital, core funding. It is an absolute must. You know, I struggle to understand why organizations still insist on restricted funding. As far as I'm concerned, if you don't have that trust there, if you need to micro monitor the organization you're giving money to, then you probably shouldn't be partnering with them in the first place. We need to have trust in the organizations that we work with. We need to let them take the decisions. We need to give them money for basic things like salary and systems and accounting software and marketing and communications. If you insist that all your money is going to go just to programmatic work and not to the part of the organization that's going to run those programs, then you've kind of missed the point. And I think that we've had a much more vociferous argument for core funding in the last couple of years on the back of COVID. A couple of things that happened. So you've got the Loudest Foundation put out a great report on core funding, the importance of that. There are multiple others. There's more noise coming out of the US, where you see, large donors like McKinsey Scott that has made a real focus on that. But it's still a long way off from being the norm. The Center for Disaster Philanthropy put out a report noting that if you took out McKinsey Scott's funding from the pot of philanthropic capital responding to COVID, only 20% was unrestricted. So even at a time of absolute crisis, donors are still calling the shots, saying, well, we think you should spend it on X, Y, Z, as opposed to saying to the organization, what are your needs? Particularly ironic, given that we're all talking about resilience and building back better. You know, how can you be resilient if you don't have money to pay your staff? And we heard that time and time again during our own work, and it was really quite devastating to hear organizations, simply couldn't keep paying salaries, because even though they had some funding, that funding had to be dedicated to a specific program with earmarks, and they couldn't use it as they chose to. And again, it very much relates to the idea of shifting the power. These organizations, grassroots organizations that are there on the ground delivering the impact, need to be part of the decision-making process.
Yeah, no, I was literally thinking the same thing there. It is back to this power and the idea that, clearly, whether it's an individual, whether it's a foundation that's been funded by one or more individuals wanting to do good, clearly they've brought a lot to the table on the one hand, but actually perhaps it's time for people to step back, organisations, trusts and foundations to step back and realise that the people who understand how best to achieve the impact, are the people either literally on the ground or involved directly in that process. And as you say, you can't make these things happen without having the other pillars of the organisation in place, without having the ability to pay your staff, etc., which all feed into the ability to deliver the mission in the first place. So no, I absolutely agree. I wonder though, turning the tone a little bit as well around to things that perhaps you could hold up as brilliant examples of where there has been a really strategic delivery, anywhere, but particularly in the kind of emerging, in the global south, in the emerging countries, you know, where you could say, you could point to one or maybe two examples where actually you can see there has been a real impact and it's worked really well?
Yeah, so I think in our work, you know, and you're right to point out the good stuff. Sometimes in our sector, we spend too long talking about the challenges, and they're having great things happening. Of course, you know, philanthropy should be and is a very positive space to be in. This is about us people trying to make the world a better place. Not want to deploy a cliche, but it literally is about that. So I think it is great that we also take time out to highlight the good stuff that is happening. I think we've seen so many good examples, you know, but I'll try to just give you a couple. So one of the things we've seen is coming out of Africa. So I think African philanthropy, even 3-5 years ago, was less on the kind of global radar screen. And on the back of COVID, we've seen some incredible organizations come to the fore across the continent. And we've seen really powerful communities and networks emerge. So there are multiple now African philanthropic networks. We are seeing peer conversations, peer discussions, events that are uniting African voices. We're seeing our research, a lot of organizations in Africa now looking at peer funding, you know, so trying to move away from just looking to the global north for financial resources and looking at how they can fund themselves, how they can create professional networks across the continent. You know, we recently signed an MOU with CAPSI, which is kind of our counterpart in Sub-Saharan Africa. So they're the Wits Business School, the Center for African Social Investment and Philanthropy. And they're doing great work, you know, really bringing an African voice to what are the needs of the sector. They're doing research across the continent, publishing reports that are put together by a wide range of diverse practitioners coming from. So I think that momentum that we've seen coming out of Africa, just kind of the coalescence of a community, just raised the voice. You know, you're seeing regularly now events happening, meetings, conferences, discussions, social media connections, and the emergence of multiple, I mean, there's too many to name, but multiple excellent role models coming out of African philanthropy at a time when, of course, that is needed because there is growth in African philanthropy as we see, you know, increasing numbers of high net worth, but also increasing number of businesses willing to invest philanthropically rather than just simply putting money into perhaps a more traditional CSR program. So I'd say that's been great, really seeing the creation of that network. We're also seeing, I think, a similar trend in Southeast Asia in our work, you know, the emergence of some truly powerful stories of foundations, Asian foundations that have transformed the way they give, that are working increasingly with governments. And I think that's important. So foundations, and actually, I mean, I say Southeast Asia because that's our core market, but even in Brazil, we've got several examples of foundations that have said, for decades, they have been trying to work with government, trying to support public sector spending, often in the space of education and health, obviously, and where historically that was often very difficult for some of the reasons that I mentioned earlier. On the back of COVID, suddenly governments are realizing that this is a huge opportunity to connect with philanthropists. Obviously, the most immediate upside, of course, is that it's money, additional money coming at a time when sometimes public spending is reduced, but also bringing innovation. I mean, I think the example of online education is classic. So I could cite literally 3 or 4 foundations that we interviewed who said, we already had an online educational learning program that we had been lobbying the government to deploy for a long time before COVID hit. Suddenly, once COVID hit, governments were chasing us, saying, we need that online mechanism and platform and content that you have, please, because we need to put it in place tomorrow because the entirety of our schools are now operating virtually. So I think that's been, so not only, okay, you could say that's a fairly opportunistic approach from the part of governments, but I think it's been a bit of a game changer in the way governments are starting to understand philanthropic capital, in that it has forced them. And I say Brazil and Southeast Asia, but we've also seen this in the Middle East and in Africa as well, where governments are then sort of thinking to themselves, actually, these guys are doing great stuff and they have the ability to be innovative. That is indeed the point of philanthropic capital, right? You can take risks where others can't. You can test solutions that others might not have the risk appetite or the capacity to do. And the governments are starting to understand that philanthropy can be source of innovation and system change. It can create solutions, but philanthropy is not necessarily going to be able to scale them up. So that's a real opportunity for governments to come in then and take those solutions and scale them up. And I actually think that's the most powerful way that philanthropy works, is when you allow philanthropists to go off and be kind of mad scientists, if you like, in laboratories, come up with solutions and then present them to governments and work with governments to scale them up. I think that is a very efficient way. You can create economies of scale, you can create partnerships and shared learning, shared data. And I think that, I have to say, before COVID, I might have struggled to find examples of that. But, after COVID, there are lots of examples of that happening.
Yeah, and I think actually, interestingly, in the UK context, there are some good examples of that have happened, probably not quite on the scale that might be needed in the global south, for example, but some really good examples of even in a very local level, dealing with issues in inner city problems, for example. Philanthropists club together. They say to the local government or to central government, we will fund this. We think this is a solution. We'll fund this for the next 2 years. If it works and we hit these metrics, we expect you to take it forward for the next 10.
And, government's then happy to sign up for that because, as you pointed out, it de-risks it for them initially, whereas they were probably unlikely to dip their toe in that water for the first 2 or 3 years because there's too much uncertainty, there's too much money at stake. So I think if those kind of solutions could be scaled up in a meaningful way to tackle some of the, the bigger problems that might exist out there where philanthropy could have an impact, I think you're absolutely right. It's back to this word power again. I think there's huge scope there. A couple of other questions come to mind. First, a really short and punchy one. Does the Global South need, or maybe does the Global South already have, and I'm showing my ignorance, does it need its own Bill Gates?
Yeah, I think that's certainly not one that has a quick, short answer.
It was a quick, short question, at least.
Yeah, so I mean, the whole question of billionaire philanthropy is one that's, obviously right out there at the moment. And I do have my thoughts on that in the sense that, and again, it goes back to the power dynamic. I mean, clearly, if philanthropic capital and the deployment thereof is being overly dominated by billionaires, it's a problem because you are concentrating power. So that is definitely a challenge. And, and we've seen that, we did some work with the OECD that look at their Net Forward and their development center looking at philanthropy for development specifically. And we're seeing that of the pots of philanthropic capital from the global north that go towards specific sectors, there are some that are very concentrated in the hands of 1 or 2 organizations. So I don't think that's a good thing. I think clearly having access to those kind of financial resources is needed. Let's not kid ourselves that suddenly the Global South is going to find all of the capital that it needs in local markets, although there is a very positive and huge drive in that direction to say, well, what can we source locally? But I think having these standout individual leaders is a bit of a double-edged thing, in the sense that, so if they can mobilize additional capital, great. If they create overly concentrated pools of power, not so great. And I think what I would rather see, quite frankly, so if you look at Africa, there is the emergence of some very high profile, high net worth individuals who've been doing this for quite some time. I mean, not related to COVID necessarily, there are a good few across Africa and of course the Middle East and Asia. But I think in a positive sense, there's no one individual that stands out, which is a good thing. So there's slightly more equitable distribution of power, if you like, within the millionaire/billionaire space of the Global South, which is obviously a very good thing. But in our work, where we see the really interesting innovation coming from is the kind of unsung heroes on the ground. So it's the smaller community organizations. That's where you're really getting a huge amount of innovation driven by dire need and by crisis. But that's what I would like to see, and that's really what our Shift to Power series is all about, trying to give profile and amplify the voices of those individuals who are not necessarily the ones who've got the capital to deploy. And of course, having that capital to deploy is very important. But they are the ones saying, let's do this differently. What we used to do historically didn't work. And that's why we still have SDGs. Let's do this thing differently. So I certainly don't think that the Global South needs a Bill Gates. I think the Global South needs additional financial resources to the tune of trillions of dollars. That was pre-COVID, the UN estimates of 2.5 trillion for annual commitments to SDG. So clearly that has inevitably increased. So they need financial resources, but those financial resources need to be deployed with much greater sensitivity to the actual needs on the ground, much more unrestricted capital, and much more input, if not predominantly input from the people at the front line of those communities. And that capital, obviously, as I said before, needs to go very significantly towards capacity building and not just programmatic work.
Yeah. Now, you touched on a few things that you think need to happen there. I'm just going to ask you a sort of more direct question. If you were a philanthropist then, and you were in that privileged position of perhaps being able to make a large impact financially, start with the money, obviously, is the thing that is always there in this context. How would you approach that then? In addition to some of the points you just made there about, what needs to happen, how would you approach it? What would kind of shape your decision making and thinking around that?
So if I were a billionaire philanthropist, what I would do is I identify a gap. I would not want to just throw my money out into the ether at something that I thought was particularly interesting. I would want to have a look at data. I'd want to look at who's doing what globally. I'd look at the SDGs, for all of their complexity, are a very useful framework. I'd look at where is the greatest need and where is nobody else putting any money in. Some of these areas that we've touched on where others are, not willing to tread. Well, let's go there. Let's go to the difficult places. Often philanthropic capital, despite it ostensibly being risk capital, takes the easy route and goes into sectors where others have already gone. And I think I wouldn't want to do that. I'd want to be game changing. I'd want to identify where the gaps are, where you can have most impact at scale. So an area where you can potentially create systemic risk. And then I would be asking, okay, who's already doing interesting work in this space on the ground? And they might be tiny organizations, they might be community leaders, and I'd want to start creating solutions with that input. So, really spending quite a lot of upfront time understanding the problem and the solution and developing the solution, and then throwing vast amounts of capital to scale up that solution once it's been tested. So that would be my approach, but it's got to be about where the gaps are. Time and time again, we see philanthropists putting money into areas where lots of people have already invested money and it hasn't yet created the system change or eradicated the problem. And I think that's a big challenge in our sector, that philanthropists often want to go where others have been because they see it as less risky, overlooking that this is a risk sector. And they're just not willing perhaps to do the slightly more radical, if you like, often interventions that could perhaps create much more significant change.
Yeah. Is there, in your opinion, then, is there a lot of almost waste or inefficiency in philanthropy, especially philanthropy arguably done with the best of intentions, perhaps done badly or lacking that strategy? How much wastage do you think there is?
Absolutely. And it's not just philanthropy, it's aid as well. So that discussion. So I remember in the 1990s when I was working in Palestine and when I was studying development and then working in Palestine, there was this whole discourse around aid effectiveness. And well, quite frankly, when I was at university in the early 90s, we were talking about how aid wasn't effective. It wasn't even a conversation. It was kind of this ain't working. Yeah. So I think, yes, there has been a huge challenge around effectiveness of how aid and now philanthropy is deployed for development. Now, this is not to say that people, aren't well-intentioned, but these are challenges around, especially in developing markets where you don't have good centralized data, you don't have strong institutional structures to support the deployment, you don't have really good understanding of what are the actual needs on the ground. You don't have, there's also this, rather strange approach to philanthropy, as I say, where, philanthropists, up and coming philanthropists will jump to market without standing back and saying, well, actually, where's the need? And too often, and again, this relates to power and perhaps a little bit of ego, it's about, well, where do I think it will be kind of the most interesting to intervene, rather than where is it actually most needed? So again, if I were a billionaire philanthropist and I was hugely passionate about arts and culture, for example, I would still try and restrain myself and ask myself, well, where is the most need before jumping? And I think that's something that happens too often in our sector, that philanthropists jump into the areas that are of particular interest without understanding. And it doesn't mean you can't invest in that sector, but okay, then where within that sector? So if it is arts and culture, maybe it's not another gallery, maybe it's, building artists collectives at a grassroots level. It's really about taking the time to understand where the needs, where the gaps, and then making sure your solution works. So that's also something that we're not very good at in our sector. Once we created a programmatic intervention, we're often too keen to run with it. Let's do this for 4, 3, 5, 10 years, whatever. And then when we figure out, actually, it's not working that well, we're a little bit reluctant to say that up front, because I think there's this expectation on us as philanthropists that we can't fail, that we've got to be able to prove that we are creating system change and driving a positive, net impact. And I think we need to have the courage to stand back and say that, look, we're not going to be able to deliver solutions overnight. We do need to test solutions in upfront before we deploy them at scale. And where we make mistakes, then let's talk about that. I mean, we were, when I was at Shell Foundation, we published a report in 2010 on the mistakes we'd made, essentially, and what we had learned from them. When I was at Emirates Foundation, we had one program where the outcomes weren't what we expected. They weren't as good as we expected. So we had to redevelop the program. And that was great. We were very open and transparent with people up front, with our stakeholders, with our board. We said, look, sorry, we planned X, it didn't work because of Y. So now we're recalibrating the program. And I think that process of learning and sharing and adapting and making sure that we don't make the mistakes again is not nearly as well developed in our sector as it should be. I think there's still way too much fear around talking about failure. And that again is almost, we've been saying that ad nauseum, oh, we need to share failure, but we're still not doing it. People are still not doing it. And yes, we've all acknowledged, the need to talk about failure, but so let's do it then, and do things like Shell Foundation did in 2010. Publish the mistake, say, this is where it didn't work and this is how we've rectified it. I think that is something that absolutely needs a lot more work. And I think that's something that, hopefully we at the center, we can also contribute to, create these communities, create this safe place where people can share what works, what doesn't. And I think that's hugely important.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, that last point about failure and sharing. I mean, not being afraid for things not to go right, but actually then also sharing when they haven't. I mean, to be honest, and operating in a prestigious academic institution like you are, I think having your centre having the bravery to do that more often will be refreshing. I know as someone who used to wear a lab coat many moons ago as a chemist, often you would lament the fact that there wasn't more evidence in the literature of things that hadn't worked, and then instead there was obviously lots of great good literature of things that had. So you can learn just as much from what paths not to tread down as you can from the map telling you which way to go. I'm conscious of time, but there was something else I wanted to ask you about. Excuse me, about this idea of people and businesses being more purpose-driven. This seems to be, an emergent theme now. People want to work for purpose-driven organisations, and organisations themselves, as they look at CSR and ESG and think about the world, they want to be more purpose-driven. So I just wondered whether you had seen any of that, the emergence of purpose-driven giving, either from a corporate philanthropic perspective, or even if you're observing any trends that are driving people's philanthropy to be about purpose now as much as about the issue itself, if you see what I mean?
Well, I think, the word purpose is often perhaps, a little bit misconstrued or a bit of maybe even a misnomer. Because as far as I'm concerned, purpose is to have impact, right? Why? I mean, if you're just doing philanthropy because it makes you feel good, well, I guess that's also okay. But But to me, you know, philanthropy is about having an impact. That's the whole point of it, is that you're trying to address a socioeconomic issue that is, you're trying to solve a problem. So, you know, I'm not quite sure that you can solve problems if you're not purposeful about it.
I think the context, maybe even more specifically with corporates, might be around how do they make their purpose as a business that's profit making be more strategically aligned with a purpose that might be
right. Sorry, yes, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
Society.
So I think there's an inevitability to that. So I think, you know, I have watched very closely, you know, I've worked in big corporates. I worked for Shell and for Visa International, and I, you know, worked for other organizations helping advise them, business organizations. I think there's an inevitability to that. I think in the 21st century, if you're a business and you want to grow at scale, grow, not necessarily grow commercially, but grow, shall we say, ethically, then you realize that you have to be engaged with more than just your immediate clients. You know, you've got to be looking at the broader stakeholder community. You cannot simply, I mean, the oil and gas sector, you cannot simply go and extract hydrocarbons from under the ground and ignore the people around you. We've learned that lesson in the last century. So in the 21st century, I think all businesses have recognized that you have to be purposeful in that you are engaging with the entirety of your stakeholder base and not just those to whom you are beholden from a financial perspective, so clients and shareholders. So I think, but I don't think companies have any choice anymore. So I think, you know, if you don't have that kind of purposefulness within your commercial strategy, you're not going to last very long, quite simply, because younger generations will hold you to account. The digital revolution that is just beginning will hold you to account and expose you. And quite frankly, you just your operational footprint will come unstuck if you are not ensuring that your goals and your strategy fundamentally has embedded within it purposefulness, sustainability, if you want to call it, ESG metrics, you want to call it, or social impact. So I think, you know, organizations who aren't thinking down that line are probably not going to be around for very long.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I'm sure that many businesses that have survived multiple generations, particularly some of the world's larger family-owned organizations, will now be thinking very carefully about, you know, how do they make themselves relevant and consistent for the future.
Absolutely. And that, by the way, that is not a cost. That's an investment, right? Yeah. So if you're taking this approach to your commercial strategy, you're looking at creating not just commercial value at scale, but contributing to social value at scale, you will, I suspect, get more clients, get more traction, get more favorability, you know, and familiarity. And those are kind of the metrics you want if you're talking about creating a brand and reputation. So I think, you know, being purposeful is just, you know, an inevitability and a necessity in this day and age. And anybody who hasn't thought that through in their commercial strategy is really missing an opportunity. As I say, this is not about a cost. This is about investing for the future.
Yeah, that's a great way to think about it. And I think perhaps a great question and an answer to end on. So mindful of your time, which we're extremely grateful for, unless there's anything further that was kind of bubbling under that you felt you wanted to share, I'd just like to take the opportunity to thank you so much for giving us your time this morning to chat through some of these issues with us, share your perspectives on it, share a little bit about the great work that the Centre for Strategic Philanthropy is doing. We'll continue to track progress and stay involved as well. And yeah, as I say, thank you so much for giving us your time and your input and your insight today. It's been really great speaking to you, Clare, so thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been great to share ideas, and we look forward to doing more with you.
Brilliant. Thanks so much.